Okay, now welcome back to part B of this video. So we're talking about labor unions. And so we talked about the fact that workers, they wanted to have the ability to form these labor unions so that they could give themselves more political power. So now you can pause this video and you can read pages 127 to 128 in your textbook. And you can learn about these three things and you can answer these three questions. So go ahead and pause the video and do that now. Okay, welcome back. We're going to go over the answers to these questions together. So what are labor unions? They're also known as trade unions, fun fact. And so these are groups of people, groups of workers who try to improve the working conditions and wages for the workers who are part of the union. Okay, so they tend to be more collectivist, right? So they might exist in a more individualist society, but the unions themselves are a pretty collectivist thing because they're doing things out of the collective interest of all people in the union. Now, what strategies do labor unions sometimes use to improve wages and conditions? Well, as you might already know, labor unions, they can use their strength in numbers. They can use strikes or they can use work stoppages to force business owners to negotiate. So if the workers of a business are not very happy with the way they're being treated, well, they can tell their boss, hey, we're going to stop working starting tomorrow until you start paying us better or you start giving us better benefits or whatever it is that they want, right? And if they all stop working, well, then their bosses are going to start losing money because the bosses rely on their workers to make money, right? Number three, what specific things did labor unions try to accomplish during the late 1800s and early 1900s? So they were trying to limit workday hours, create safer working conditions, protect job security, allow them to have medical benefits, meaning if they needed to go to the doctor or dentist or something like that, they would have medical insurance that would be provided for them through their employers, and also legal services. So that would be access to a union lawyer who could defend them if they needed to go to court against their bosses. And eventually, labor unions really took off. So by 1919, there were enough labor unions in the Western liberal democracies of the world that the International Labor Organization was formed as part of the League of Nations even. And now it's time to learn about the Winnipeg General Strike. So here's a Canadian story for you. So you can read page 137 from the textbook, and you can write 3 sentences containing the main points of the article. So go and do that now. Welcome back. So what do we got? 30,000 workers left their jobs and began a 6-week strike. So these were workers for the railway, they were post office workers, retail, store employees, police officers, firefighters. These were all working class people who decided to go on strike because they had a lot of demands. However, a group of manufacturers, bankers, politicians, so these are more the business class people, they made an attempt to discredit the strikers. They called them communists in the newspapers. So here you can really see that there's a struggle between the two social classes, right? Between the working class people and the more business owner class. And the federal government forced people back to work, or otherwise they would be fired. And that gives you an idea of which side the federal government was on at the time, right? The government was willing to back up the business owners instead of the people who were working in these businesses. People were arrested, people were injured, one was even killed at the time. And eventually the federal government called in the army, right? The military came in and forced the strikers back to work, right? Which really shows you that the government was on the side of the business owners at the time. So speaking of democracy, take a look at the voting reform bills of the 1800s. So throughout the 1800s, let's see how many people gained the right to vote in Britain. So before 1832, only 2% of people who would otherwise be eligible to vote actually had the right to vote, right? And then after 1832, big increase, a 50% increase. Now it's 3% of the population. And then it increases in 1867 to 7% of Britain's population who would normally be eligible to vote can now vote, and then it doubles to 14%. So this kind of shows you that throughout the 1800s, not that many people gained the right to vote. Okay, still most people were not given the right to vote, even though by today's standards we would give them the right to vote. So take a look in your partial notes and read through this timeline here. It's a timeline of Canada's progression towards universal suffrage. So today we have what's called universal suffrage, where virtually all people who are citizens of Canada, who are adults, have the right to vote. But if you look through this timeline, you're going to see that that has not always been the case. So this is in your partial notes. You can take a look on the back side of your lesson 2 partial notes to see that some people were not given the right to vote until quite recently. So speaking of voting, we're going to talk about women's suffrage, and first, a little bit more broadly, we're going to talk about just feminism in general. Okay, so feminism is the belief in the social, political, and economic equality of women. So if you are a feminist, all that means is that you believe men and women should be treated equally. Okay, so let's go back to the Industrial Revolution for a minute. So before the Industrial Revolution, it was believed that men and women occupied separate spheres in society. So they had different roles in society. The role of the man was to go to work and make money for the family, and also to participate in leadership roles in society, whereas the role of women was to stay home and take care of the kids. And typically, the education of women has been considered to be less important. But then with the Industrial Revolution, we start to see that women are actually going to work. So this is a picture of an American factory during the Industrial Revolution. And you see these are young women who are getting jobs in factories and making money for themselves. So this leads to a bit of independence, right? But only a little bit, right? These women, as soon as they get married, they are most likely going to stop working and they're going to stay home and do what this woman over here is doing. And also, they're not going to be becoming, managers or bosses, and they're not going to start businesses of their own, right? So this is a very small step towards equality. But by the mid 1800s, some people thought that women should have the same rights as men, right? And that they should have the right to vote. And these people would be considered suffragettes. These are members of organizations who fought for women's suffrage. And so a famous suffragette in Canada, her name was Emily Stowe. She became the first female doctor in Canada in 1867. And then 10 years later, she started the Toronto Women's Guild, which is an organization that fought for women's suffrage. And so nowadays, we'd probably consider her to be a liberal, right? She wanted to keep democracy, but she just wanted to expand democracy to include more people. However, at the time, people who were opposed to her would probably have seen her as a radical. Okay, but eventually, for the most part, between the 1890s and 1920, many countries gave women the right to vote. Okay, so it really depends on the country. If you take a look at this map, you're going to see that Canada gave women the right to vote in 1917. However, they didn't actually vote until 1918. In the United States, this was in 1920. Through much of Africa, this was later on, partly because many of these African nations didn't get their independence, so they didn't get the right to vote until later on. Some of the originals would have been down here, right? So 1893 is when women got the right to vote in New Zealand, Australia, in 1902. Take a look at this country right here. This is Saudi Arabia. They only gave women the right to vote just a few years ago. All right, so it's happened at different times for different places. So Canada, 1918. Now we move on to the non-persons cause. So even though women had gained the right to vote, they were still considered non-persons under the law. Right? So in Canada, we were using the British common law, and this stated that women are persons in the matters of pains and penalties, but not in the matter of rights and privileges. So there was an important woman named Emily Murphy. She was a judge. She was actually Albertan, and as a judge, she would have to rule on certain cases. And sometimes the lawyers who were pleading their case to the judge would say, hey, well, we don't have to listen to your ruling because you are not actually considered a person under Canadian law. Well, she didn't like that very much. So as a member of the famous five, she fought for women to be considered persons under Canadian law. And these famous five women, They took this case all the way to Canada's highest court, and they won, right? And so now, under Canadian law, women are considered persons, right? If you're in class today, then you're going to watch some clips from this movie, which goes over the women's suffragette movement in the United States. Okay. And let's move on to progressivism. This is the last concept we're going to go over in this lesson. So progressivism is a form of welfare capitalism that was implemented in the United States, and it was implemented by this man right here. Right? Does he not look like just a big teddy bear to you? Right? Well, if the answer is yes, it's probably because his name was Theodore or Teddy Roosevelt, and he got this nickname when he was on a hunting trip with some other politicians, and his friends found this little bear cub, and they decided to, capture the bear cub, tie him to a tree, and then they called over the president and said, "Hey, we got this bear that you can shoot, and then you'll be able to say that you had a successful hunting trip." And he said, he walked over and he saw the little bear cub, and he felt so guilty and so bad that he said, "No, I refuse to shoot the bear." And so people made fun of him for being such a softy, and they called him Teddy Roosevelt. And the name really stuck. We still call him that all the time. So he was a reformer who made efforts to curb the excess of laissez-faire capitalism during his presidency. So basically, he implemented welfare capitalism in the United States. So in 1902, when 50,000 United Mine workers went on strike demanding a raise and a recognition of their union and an 8-hour workday plus benefits, right? They were asking for a lot of different things. The mine owners refused these demands. They called on Roosevelt to call out the army against these workers and force them back to work. So remember the Winnipeg general strike that happened here in Canada, right? The federal government called on the military to force those workers back to work. So the mine owners asked Theodore Roosevelt to do the same thing, except Theodore Roosevelt threatened to call out the army against the business owners if they wouldn't negotiate with the workers. All right, so Roosevelt coined the term square deal to signify that both the workers and the owners should be treated fairly. Right, so he was not necessarily on the side of the business owners every time, which was something that we would have expected from governments at the time. For the most part, governments were always on the business owner's side. But with Theodore Roosevelt, he wanted to have a square deal, like a fair deal. He wanted the business owners, but also the working class to be treated fairly. So he said the labor unions shall have a square deal, the corporations shall have a square deal, and in addition, all private citizens shall have a square deal, right? And so he was part of the Progressivism movement, which was a 1920s movement in the USA, usually associated with President Theodore Roosevelt, that reacted to the perceived abuses of laissez-faire capitalism by large corporations. So he formed a political party after serving as president for a couple terms, and it was called the National Progressive Party. And here's a few things from their party platform. First thing, the Progressive Party, believing that no people can justly claim to be a true democracy which denies political rights on account of sex, pledges itself to the task of securing equal suffrage to men and women alike. So, first thing is, give women the right to vote. Okay, pretty progressive. We pledge ourselves to work unceasingly in state and nation for, number one, effective legislation looking to the prevention of industrial accidents, occupational diseases, overwork, involuntary unemployment, and other. So basically, laws that lead to more safety in the workplace, right? And then next, the fixing of minimum safety and health standards for the various occupations, right? So more safety laws, the prohibition of child labor, right? No more child labor, minimum wage for women to provide a living wage in all industrial occupations, right? So minimum wage. So these are all forms of welfare capitalism, right? Where the government intervenes by creating legislation in the workplace, right? By regulating the workplace. But it does not include a big social safety net, right? The government does not have programs like social programs to assist people in the areas of education, housing standards, disability, or child poverty, right? So this is welfare capitalism. It's a small step to the left on the ideological spectrum to give more regulation in the workplace, and people receive a small social safety net, but through their employer and not through their government. Okay, so that is everything for today's lesson. Hope you learned a couple things, and I'll see you in class.